So welcome to our session about OpenDDR and Jakarta MVC. So little overview. First, we do an introduction. I'll also introduce ourselves. Then I will cover the history of OpenDDR and similar approaches. Then I will briefly touch the two most common MVC frameworks, which are Spring and the specialty called Spring Mobile, which is an extension, as well as Jakarta MVC, where we also created an extension and wrapper around the OpenDDR framework. And IVAR is going to show that since he's one of the project leads of the Jakarta MVC project. So first, a little bit about myself. I'm a consultant and coach working for various companies, everywhere from embedded to backend and enterprise. Right now, I'm a little more on the RCP side again. I'm an open source evangelist and contributor to several projects. I'm a maintenance lead of the units of measurement GSR. And I also took over as one of the maintenance leads of the Java Money GSR. And I'm also the committer representative in the Jakarta EE spec committee.
Okay, and then it's me then. I'm Ivar GRIMSTAD. I'm the Jakarta EE developer advocate at Eclipse Foundation. I'm a jug leader here in Malmö, and I'm a Java champion. And as Werner said, I'm one of the project leads in the Jakarta MVC specification. We've been leading it through the JCP as JSR 371 and released a version there in the beginning of this year, actually. And later this year, we've actually released two versions. So yesterday, we released the version 2.0 of Jakarta MVC. So that's what we're going to use in this demo as well. So it's very fresh and new version. So back to you, Werner.
Yeah. So actually, OpenDDR also, I think, had the world premiere at what was then the Mobile 2 Days conference in 2011. I found a little rakia here, so it's a bit of celebrating that anniversary. And it's also actually these days and this week, literally the anniversary when OpenDDR came back under the current domain after Apache DeviceMap was archived and discontinued, but we'll come to that in the history. So there are so many devices nowadays and different attributes, like you got smartphones, smart watches, foldable devices, and all sorts of new devices with different attributes. So it's very hard to cope. What is a DDR? Okay, I guess especially in Bulgaria, you probably also still remember that time. It's actually an acronym that's not the Trump wall. It's also an acronym for a memory format, which I believe is still in use.
Do you remember what the acronym is for the memory?
You mean what the three letters stood for, DDR? Yeah. I'm not exactly sure. I believe R must be RAM, but whether D stands for direct or something, I can't exactly remember. Do you know?
No, I can't remember either, but I remember DDR3. Yeah.
Yeah. So OpenDDR is currently the last surviving open source project that implements the device definition repository standard. That's a W3C spec that was finalized in 2008. So It's also been it's now pretty stable. That's why OpenDDR is different in the sense that it's open source and free to use, both for commercial and non-commercial applications. And even though over the years, some of the power users have now shifted a little bit to something like responsive CSS design, and some of them may no longer need vast device repository. There have been several power users. Yeah, we talked about the weather. Weather.com was using it for a very long time. I'm not sure if they still are now that they are part of IBM, but earlier they were using this in their various applications. So a little bit about the history. There was an open source project called Worthful until approximately 2011, and in summer 2011, some of the project leads actually decided they want to make a lot of money with it, and they decided to take the former open source project and turn it into a closed source project, which it now still is. Sad, and some of them even felt betrayed for their contributions because their efforts have been taken away, and somebody else is now selling them, and they can no longer access it, at least not unless they pay for it. So some of those former contributors gathered and helped us create the OpenDDR project in the second half of 2011. So that was also when I first presented it at Mobile 2 Days in 2011. And the Apache committers and some Apache projects that are also dealing with device recognition noticed this effort. And so OpenDDR was one of the founding members of the Apache project called DeviceMap in the incubator. It also graduated about 2 to 3 years later. But unfortunately, the momentum that OpenDDR had before that, when almost every month a new release of the device data was released, in Apache, the momentum was not quite so massive, and the number of committers didn't grow. And some of the sub-projects for .NET and others were almost stopped, and people could no longer contribute. So at some point, when the activity became very low, in January 2017, DeviceMap was retired after the last PMC members decided that it was not worth, and there were too few of them who were really active. And since in Apache there's a process where things have to be approved by a minimum number of 2 or 3 or more, having fewer than that made it very complicated and almost impossible to find decisions. So that's why it was retired. But that was not the end, because in late 2017, I think it was actually in late 2016, so more or less an overlap before it retired. This domain, OpenDDR.mobi, was registered, and we contributed that as an initial contribution. And after some time, in the middle of 2018, there was actually a record spike, sometimes even above the 500,000 downloads per year. So, of course, some projects like Spring and Spring Boot probably have millions of downloads per year, but I guess there are not so many open source projects other than that who can say that they are downloaded hundreds of thousands of times per year or 10,000 of times each month. So it was solid 6-digit also in 2019. This year, because some of the main power users moved to something else, like using CSS. So there have been a bit fewer downloads, but they're still solid, and it should be somewhere in the 5-digit region by the end of this year. And as long as it continues like that, it has never been that successful when it comes to downloads, while it was DeviceMap at Apache. There we had sometimes no more than triple digits each year. So what are the other solutions? These are probably the only remaining ones aside from OpenDDR. The two bottom ones, I believe, are more or less dead or disappeared after several mergers and acquisitions. So I don't think these still exist. If they do, then they're only available under a commercial license in closed source. The same is for Worthful, which after August 2011 is only available through a closed source license. Few bits and pieces may be available in a license where it's that special license that I think MongoDB also uses, which you can see the code, but you're not allowed to use it in a service unless you pay for it. So it's not completely open source, and most of the rest is actually closed source. The same for Device Atlas, and 51°mobi is probably an interesting example because they do have a few free bits and pieces. So it's a bit like freeware with commercial extensions that are then in a pro edition that you have to pay for. So they have some free parts, and they are also, I believe, the only one that supports Java and .NET. And most of them also support JavaScript nowadays on Node.js. So other than OpenDDR, I guess only 51°mobi is the only other vendor or provider that has some part of transparent and open approaches and libraries, while the others are pretty much closed source. So OpenDDR is based on open standards. The repository is compliant with the W3C DDR standard. It's been under Apache license pretty much ever since. So even before we went to Apache, it was Apache licensed, which also made it easier to go back and stay with the license. It's also, by the way, the same license that Jakarta MVC uses. So here it also blends in well. OpenDDR has three major aspects of a device. So based on the user agent, it extracts information about the physical device, the operating system, and the web browser. It has a so-called confidence level, which is a bit like a threshold of precision, where you can decide if you want a very high confidence, then you can be more precise. If you want a lower level of confidence, then sometimes you may only recognize a device as being Android general purpose or something like that. But that means it will be faster and it takes less memory that way.
So we have a question here. What kind of data exactly is it for each device? So what kind of data can you get from OpenDDR?
It's the screen size, and for some newer devices that we added later on, it also contains things like how much RAM does a particular phone have, and how many memory slots, does it have memory at all? How big is the storage as opposed to the internal memory? So there are several aspects. The screen resolution is the most basic one, and a few others, including the version and the vendor of the browser. So these are the core OpenDDR properties that have been defined by the W3C ever since. And later we added some custom attributes in addition to that. So for every device, you will at least see the most basic ones. And for some devices where it has been maintained, you can also see more. And with version 2 of the device data, we also try to make that a little more flexible by adding some complex data in a tree where you can have multiple properties that are nested. At the moment, the classifier doesn't support that yet, and it's also something that is not really backward compatible, so it may not work with the classic W3C DDR client, but we want to add a little more information, especially things like foldable. And if you have a device that can be changed from a tablet to a phone or from a tablet to a desktop, the traditional flags that say is desktop, is mobile, is Nokia so and so, those properties have been very legacy and historic. That's why we try to decommission them by adding a few more that are a little more appropriate nowadays, for example, for smartwatches and similar devices. It also allows patching, including you may even add some of your own custom properties in that patch that are not part of the core specification and vocabulary. So that means you can take the existing OpenDDR data and add a patch, and then patch it by adding your own devices if you want to work in a kind of closed environment and for some reason you don't want to contribute it back to the actual project. Of course, you're very much welcome to do so, and we are happy about contributions from the community. But should you not be able to do that for some reason, then you can use a patch and you can drop in that patch and it will just add on top of the core device data. This is also a little historic because obviously we were only able to compare OpenDDR and Worthful at the time when both were still open source, or until the point where Worthful was still open source. So that's a little bit historic. So it doesn't say anything about the current commercial Worthful libraries and device data that are out there right now, or they may be optimized if you pay for it. So that's why we also skipped the diagrams, but back then when we compared them, OpenDDR usually had an advantage because when you reduce the level of confidence to the bare necessity, then you would usually have a very low footprint, and especially in the cloud, if you have to pay for the memory, that can be an advantage. So this is the way that the original W3C DDR simple API and its implementation can be customized and retrieved. So it's a bit like lookups in J2EE or Java EE almost up to 20 years ago. But then again, of course, this was defined until 2008. So they started doing this maybe almost in 2000 or 2003, and then it took them approximately up to 5 years to finalize it. So a lot of this is actually based originally on definitions that you would probably have seen in J2EE while it was still called J2EE. And that also made it a lot harder to retrieve the device data from a different distributed location, because all of this has to be in the same file system. But this is why the new Java client, or so-called classifier, was enhanced. Most of this was actually done while it was at Apache DeviceMap, and the data can be loaded either from a URL that could be on the other end of the world, or you can also load it directly from our OpenDDR repositories that are either located on the website or on bin tray in a DDR. Or you can use a jar file, or you can also use a exploded file system. So the last one would be more or less comparable to how it was done in the W3C DDR client. So the last way of retrieving it from a folder is very similar and would also be compatible to the DDR Lite client, while the others make you a little more flexible because you can either drop it as a jar, or you could even retrieve it dynamically from a different location. I'm not going to show this here this time, but again, mention that OpenDDR is also available for .NET. Yeah, this was taken, I think, 1 or 2 years ago. So that's actually the Station European Union in Sofia, Metro. So as a summary, OpenDDR is open and free. It's based on W3C standards. So it's also similar to other specs like servlets or WebSockets that also embrace W3C standards. You can easily migrate from the traditional W3C simple API to the new one because the underlying repository is the same. So let's take a little look at the MVC frameworks. So Spring Mobile has been around for quite a while, and it supports, on top of Spring MVC, a similar device detection, although in the most basic setup that I'm also going to show, it's more or less a parser for the user agent. So it doesn't need any external references, but you can also enrich it with an underlying device repository. And I believe there are some extensions for 51 degrees mobile. And at least before it was changed to closed source, I know that Spring Mobile supported Worthful, but when it was moved into closed source, I believe they discontinued that and they no longer support it. So you may find closed source extensions and libraries and plugins for Worthful or other competitors, but open source, I believe, out of the box, it's mostly simple parsing the user agent. So this is one example. So there's a similar POJO and model object to what OpenDDR has. It's called the device. But here the device only has a few attributes like is mobile, is tablet, or is desktop. And most of the other properties are pretty much hidden and automatically derived. Here's another feature called site preference. And a device-aware view resolution. Spring Mobile has not been very active lately, and I'm not sure if it's still actively maintained. It has like a version, I'm not sure which, but it has a snapshot, but that snapshot has been in snapshot for, I think, way over 5 years. And it also has not been upgraded to the most recent Spring framework version. So if you want to use it without modifying it yourself, you're stuck with a slightly older Spring version, which is why we actually went and embraced Jakarta MVC, where, as you will see now, we literally just adopted to the most recent Jakarta MVC version that has been released only a few days ago, version 2. So here you're definitely state of the art. While when you use Spring Mobile as it is and you don't customize or patch it, you may be stuck with a slightly older version of Spring. And it's also not certain whether, I guess there are so many Spring projects now that this is definitely similar to Spring Social. It's probably one that may be a little more exotic. And if it was under Eclipse or Apache, it would probably be deprecated or archived by now. So let's look at some code. First, this is the Spring mobile demo showing the REST controller and the request mapping, and then decision making based on whether is normal, is the desktop basically, is mobile, or is tablet. Eva will show you a few more aspects, but just as a simple. Can you still hear me and see me? Because
yeah.
I just got some strange pop-up saying the session has finished.
Okay, yeah, we still see you and hear you.
Yeah.
If you're welcome.
So I will hand over in a moment to Eva to show you a little more about the underlying details, but just as a simple comparison, here's the classify controller on top of Jakarta MVC.
Font size.
Okay. Is that enough or bigger? Okay. So here is the Spring mobile approach on top of Spring MVC. And here with slightly different annotations, but also annotation based, and in a relatively comparable way, you got the same on top of Jakarta MVC. Let's also show this in action. So here I already started it, and it shows on the desktop the device is a normal device. Eva will show you the Jakarta MVC demo on his machine in a moment, but for everyone who wants to try it out yourself instead of building it, you can visit the OpenDDR.mobi page, and here if you click on try it out, you see a few code snippets for both the classifier and the traditional W3C DDR. And for the classifier, you here have 3 different examples. So this is not using Spring Mobile, but you can also use Spring MVC together with the classifier. That's a plain servlet example and a Jakarta MVC example. So then over to you.
Okay, thank you. And little this morning, and I figured out that I'd update it to the latest version of MVC. And as you can see in my Maven project, I'm using the MVC 2.0, which is the latest version, and we released it this weekend. What's also notable here is that we're using the Kraso Jersey version for which is version 2.0 as well, since we are running on Glassfish, and Glassfish has a Jakarta REST implementation that is called Jersey. If I was to run it on Wildfly, which is also possible, then I would use another dependency here, which is the REST-DC dependency, as well as for OpenLiberty, also a switch to REST-DC now.
Yeah, so there's a little caveat. I believe we already planned some switches and profiles in the POM, although at least recently I have not used any of it. But if you want to deploy it with Wildfly or OpenLiberty, then you would have to build it a little different, because if you build this exactly the same way and you deploy it to Wildfly, then I think it actually runs, but it won't work to a certain point. So you cannot really call the API.
Exactly. So I haven't played with the profiles either, but there is I think there is a JBoss profile here. Mm-hmm. And you can see the JBoss profile actually brings in the cross dependency for REST-DC. So it should work if you just build it with the JBoss profile. So let's look a little bit on the code for MVC. And as I said, it has been moved to the Jakarta namespace. So you can see we're using the Jakarta namespace for both, or this is actually not anything related to MVC at all, because MVC builds on top of Jakarta REST. So it's just a simple configuration where we set the path of the application, and it's a Jakarta REST application. And our controller here is, as Werner showed, it's using the Jakarta REST at path annotation. And the only thing that kind of makes this a MVC controller is this at controller annotation, which comes from the MVC API. And the at controller here actually makes all resource methods on this class a controller. So it's not actually the class itself that is a controller, but you have one controller here for the actual classifier request. And we have one controller here for the result. We could put this in different classes or have them in the same. That's just as good. And the controller is request scoped, so it's using CDI scoped so it's initialized per request. And we inject this classified service here, which is the only thing that actually communicates with the OpenDDR. And I've chosen here to make this application scope. So what this one does is to do a lookup to load all the device information. And you don't want to do this every request, because that would slow your system down. So you do once in a while, whether application scoped or session scoped or some other scope or some timing is good for you. That depends on the use case. But in this case, I just did it for application scopes. So it will, when the application loads, it will load all the device information. And then it has some helper methods to figure out if it's a tablet or not. And then I've created a device info class, and it's just a dumb Java object. It just has whether it's a tablet or a mobile. And here you can see I'm using an interesting scope. And this is a scope that comes with, it's a custom scope for MVC, which is a redirect scope. So it will keep its values through one redirect and then be emptied again. So in my controller here, when I do the get request here first, I will use the classifier to figure out what kind of device this is. And then I will redirect this one to the result controller, which will use the device information to choose which view to display. So it's a very simple application. And the views will display slightly different information, whether it's a mobile tablet or a regular. So let's it's running here. So let's just open my browser and see this application is running here. So if I click on the classify request, you should see in the log here that it's doing some loading here. So somewhere it should say that it's doing the initializing the devices. Here you can see it's initializing, and it's loaded 2,531 devices. And this is something you would do when the application starts. And you can see here it says the redirect works. So and the redirect works comes from the redirect JSP page. If I wanted to change which device I'm running here, so I'll just use the developer tools in Chrome to simulate that I'm using a Galaxy S5 here. I'll just beef up this a little. So, okay. So you can see I'm running a Galaxy S5 and I'm clicking the try it now. And I'm clicking this link, and I hope that you can see somewhere down here that it says redirect to mobile works. I wonder why assuming didn't.
I think the tab also says mobile. So
sorry,
the title on the tab says mobile.
It says redirect to mobile works.
Else. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and if I switch this to, for example, an iPad, and try it again, it just say redirect to tablet, and it says tablet up here as well. So you can see it works whether your to detect which device you're running on, and here is it's again with a computer. So that was about what I had planned to show. So I'll switch back to you, Werner. And of course, all of this was running on Glassfish 6, which implements Jakarta E9. So we have Jakarta MVC 2.0 on Jakarta EE9 running on Glassfish 6 and using OpenDDR. So you can stay on the newest and best technology out there.
So at the moment, the demo is deliberately kept relatively simple, so it mimics more or less what this Spring Mobile demo does. But hopefully in a future version, we actually should also be able to show some of the actual device properties that you see here in the existing Spring application and in the servlet application, because there the device is also placed as an attribute into the HTTP request and or servlet request, or the equivalent in Spring, and then retrieved so that the result page not only shows that it's successful or it's a mobile device or a tablet, but it shows JSON dump representation of that particular device. So here you actually see most of these properties, at least the most basic ones, including some of the historic ones like Nokia series, which may not be too useful anymore, but they are part of the traditional DDR scope. And then you would have others like the browser version.
So we have a question here, a question about the redirect scope. And the redirect scope in MVC is it stays alive over a redirect. So you can use it when you implement the typical post redirect get pattern. That means that you post something to a form, and this form sends a redirect back to your browser. So your browser goes to a different page to display the results. And this is to prevent the double form submission things that you get if you redirect to the same page. So that's where you would use redirect scope. It's kind of specialized for this. In Spring, I think the same thing is called flow scope, but I'm not exactly sure, but I think so.
Visit all the different resources and links and sites. On top, you have the main OpenDDR website that also points you to all the live demos that you can run directly on your mobile device. then the GitHub organization that hosts everything, including the examples. There's a mailing list on Google Group. So we use Google Groups, like, for example, Eclipse Microprofile also does. The entry page to the Jakarta MVC specification. And on the bottom, if you are curious to compare or even want to use it, or maybe you want to contribute to it, there's Spring Mobile as a comparison. So yeah, if any other questions come to your mind later, then please join the Google group list or the mailing lists, including the Eclipse mailing list for Jakarta MVC if you have particular questions about Jakarta MVC. So if there are no other questions, then thank you very much.
Thank you, Ivar and Werner, for the great talk. And hopefully see you next year in the conference in live.
Yeah, I will also hope so, because then I can also probably stock on the Rakia, and depending on if we have some more news, next year will literally be the 10th anniversary of the OpenDDR project. So, but yeah, we also have other things to share and talk about, and hopefully we can probably do that again.
Maybe we can celebrate OpenDDR 10 years on Jakarta EE10.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's definitely something that we should be looking forward a year from now to see the improvements and some of the new specs, I guess, including MVC may even be part of the platform by then.
Thank you guys, and thanks for all our viewers. Session
Thank
for
you
today.
Okay, then thanks. Enjoy the rest of the week tomorrow, and hope to see you again soon, also in person.